Today's video is about the point of diminishing returns. As with all my videos, what I'm trying to do is take my over 20 years of experience from the military through corporate America and business school and boil them down into little 10-minute lessons.
All right, team. As I mentioned in the intro, the point of diminishing returns is not something that's easy to describe without some visuals. So I've created a couple of slides. Now the data in here is all arbitrary. I literally just drew these so that I could illustrate a couple of points. But I think we'll have some fun with it, and then you'll start to see these trends elsewhere in your life as you go through and you start looking at different graphs and data that might be in either a academic journal or investing returns. So let's jump in. First thing we want to talk about is a linear relationship. And this is a pretty obvious one, right? You've got 1 equals 1, and then 10 equals 10. And that means, let's just say that this was the amount of effort you were putting in to get stronger or faster. If you work out 10 times, you're going to be 10 times stronger than you were when you started. Now, obviously, that doesn't exactly apply, but there might be things that you can think about that would have a very linear relationship like this. Say if you were painting, and if you painted for 10 straight hours, you would probably have about 10 times more more of your walls painted than if you just painted for 1 hour. That's pretty straightforward. There's a bunch of things that work in a linear relationship. This is what's called a positively correlated relationship. So the more you work on the x-axis, the more you get results on the y-axis. So let's jump into what it looks like when we say a point of diminishing returns. So this is a really obvious one. There's no real data behind this, I just drew it. But this is probably a lot more accurate when we talk about, say, working out. You're going to do, let's just say that you worked out 3 times a week. And this is whatever metric it is on the left side. Maybe that's your overall fitness. If you work out 3 times a week, you're going to be getting a lot more out of it than if you only work out 1 time a week. But at some point, you're not going to be able to work out that much more, or you're not going to get as much benefit from every additional ounce of energy you put into it. So let's try and think of one that is a good example of this. Good example is probably, I would say, investing. That's probably a good one for the average person. It's not financial advice, but generally speaking, and I'll use myself as an example. If you didn't do anything with your money, it just sits there, it's not earning you any interest, and that's not good, right? So you start researching your investments. You start putting a little bit of time and energy into thinking about what are you doing with your money. But after a certain point, you've made your decisions, you've put your money in, and then staring at it doesn't actually help you anymore. And so that's a point of diminishing return. You know, if you were maybe you're looking at investing in crypto, and so you start reading about a couple different projects. You read their white papers, maybe you follow their Discord server, and so that might take you a few hours. If you spend hundreds of hours looking at that same exact project, you're not going to know that much more about it. You might be an expert in whatever that coin is, but you're not going to know enough that it's actually going to change the outcome. And so if you've made your decision that you're going to invest in it, then you invest in it, and you set a couple of triggers based on your initial work to say, all right, when this happens, then I'm going to get my money out. So this is a point of diminishing return. This is really obvious here, right? If you are putting in 4 units of work and you're going from 13 to 14, that's only a +1 in your terms of output. And again, this is just arbitrary, but just think about it this way, right? So from 1 to 2, we went from 1 to 9. So that was a big jump, right? And again, this is very applicable to investing. The first amount that you learn is orders of magnitude more than you knew if you didn't know anything. But then the more and more you learn, you're only starting to increase marginally. And so in this example, right here around 3 units of work or 4 units of work, whatever that is, whether it's hours spent investing or working out or whatever it is that you're doing to get your desired output, it's very obvious in this chart that after about 4, you have to put in a whole lot more effort to get even, from 14 to 16. So that's 2 units of output we went from 4 to 10, 6 units of input. And so you're getting a lot less out of every additional unit of input than you were at the beginning. And so there's a lot of things that look like this in terms of curves. A lot of sports kind of go like this. You're going to improve a lot when you first start out and you practice whatever that might be. Maybe you practice twice a week at softball, right? You're going to be far better than if you don't practice at all. But then at some point, you can only practice softball so much. Now, pros, professional athletes, it's literally their job, and they're dealing in the margins. We'll do another video on a normal curve, normal distribution, and that 0.1%, or in the case of pro athletes, it's probably 0.01%. They're way out there on the bell curve. So we're not going to talk too much about the bell curve today, but the point is, when you're a professional athlete, they need that extra margin, and that's something that matters to them because their livelihood depends on it. For you, if you're just going out there to play rec softball, yeah, a couple times a week you practice, you're probably going to be better than most people. Again, that's the point of diminishing returns. So this is really obvious in this particular chart where you would want to say, okay, at 3 or 4, then I have to start saying, maybe I should do something else with my time because there are other areas of my life that I want to improve on. It gets a little more complicated when we have a curve that's like this. So again, there's a point of diminishing return here, probably around 4. You can notice it's more or less a linear relationship from 1 all the way up to about 4, and then it starts to tail off. But this is less obvious, and you might say, well, it's worth it for me to work out or play softball for 5 hours or 6 hours because I do want this additional increase. And the trick is, it's hard to know before you get started in something where the point of diminishing return is. And sometimes if you're working on a project or you're going after something, you're trying to create something, it's very easy to get blinders on and you're just plugging away. You might want to take a step back and say, am I making as much progress now as I used to? And if you're not, then you might want to change up some of the things that you're doing, some of your approach. That's really on you. But again, this is a little harder to figure out. Where do you want to start saying, okay, I've put in enough effort, I've gotten to the point where I want to, and let's just move on to something else. With the first curve, it was very obvious that at 4 you were really getting pretty much as you were going to get. Something else we want to talk about is inefficiency. And so I'll use an example of probably government bureaucracy when we think about something like this. And again, so you can see here the point of diminishing return comes in at 2, and then it levels off, and basically from somewhere around 5 to 7 in this example, you're not getting any more actual output. And this happens a lot in large bureaucratic organizations. The government's very large, very bureaucratic, and so the more resources they throw at it doesn't necessarily actually increase the output or the services that people are getting, because there's so much internal friction, and sometimes throwing more resources at it doesn't actually get you anymore. What you really want to be careful of is that you don't get out here into, in this graph, 8, 9, and 10. And this is where, again, like a large bureaucratic organization, if they're throwing resources at a problem and those resources aren't actually addressing the problem, it might be, oh, we've put in another layer of oversight. And so now you had one layer of oversight, you put in another, that's not actually any output, right? There's just more people creating more reports, talking to each other. That doesn't actually increase your output. And so the takeaway from this is, you want to always make sure well, first of all, you want to be as efficient as you can. The point of diminishing return is one where you want to understand where you're getting the maximum output from your inputs, and then help you to understand where you need to increase your So the point of this slide is that there can come a time when you're actually putting in more resources and you're actually getting less output. If you are a bodybuilder or a big-time athlete, this is called overtraining. Now, to be fair, most people don't actually overtrain. They say they are, but they're not really training that hard to begin with. But certainly professional athletes can be overtrained. You can overwork themselves. This is, if you're working a project and you're saying, oh, well, we're working 80, 90 hours a week. The additional hours, if you're not, you may actually be going backwards because you're making mistakes. And that's something to be aware of. Just putting in more time doesn't necessarily equate to getting a better result. And that's what this slide is about. If you're getting no more output between 5, 6, and 7, you're probably headed towards an area where the more effort you put in, you could be going backwards. And that's why I wanted to create something about the point of diminishing return. It's an easy concept to understand, but it's definitely not something that's easy to put into practice. You have to, through trial and error, understand where your limits are, where the limits of your organization are, your team, depending on what you're doing. And that's all we've got for this video. So I'll see you next time.